last of the meat is gone. Outside, the wind hasn't stopped screaming for 6 days, and nothing has moved across that frozen plain since the herds left weeks ago. You are cold in a way that isn't about temperature anymore. It's about time, and somewhere in that cave, someone makes a decision that would horrify you if you had any other option left. This is the story of what ancient humans actually did when the cold stopped being an inconvenience and started being a countdown. Let's start with the darkest one, because it's also the best documented. Cannibalism, at a site called Gough's Cave in England dated to roughly 14,700 years ago. Right at the tail end of the last ice age, archaeologists found human bones covered in cut marks, identical to the butchery marks left on deer and horse remains from the same layer. Skulls had been carefully shaped into cups, the edges deliberately smoothed and trimmed. This wasn't an accident, and it likely wasn't malice either. It happened during one of the harshest climate windows of the entire ice age, when herds thinned out and starvation became a genuine, immediate threat. When the choice narrows down to eating what's available or dying with everyone around you, some groups apparently made a choice modern audiences find almost impossible to look at directly. But here's something that should reframe how you think about that decision, because starvation in the cold isn't just about running out of food entirely. There's a specific brutal trap called rabbit starvation, and understanding it explains a whole category of dark survival behavior. If you eat nothing but lean meat, protein without fat, your body cannot actually process it properly. Too much protein without enough fat overwhelms your liver's ability to convert it into usable energy. And you can literally starve to death with a stomach full of meat. In winter, when animals themselves are lean and depleted of fat reserves, this wasn't a rare edge case. It was a constant looming danger. So ancient humans developed something researchers now call fat factories. At sites like Neumarkt Nord in Germany, dating back roughly 125,000 years, archaeologists found enormous piles of smashed animal bones, deliberately broken into small fragments and apparently boiled in makeshift containers. This wasn't waste, this was targeted extraction. Bone marrow and bone grease are extraordinarily fat-rich, and shattering every single bone to render out every last drop of fat was, quite literally, a matter of life and death during winter months when that fat might be the only thing standing between a group and slow protein poisoning. Imagine spending hours crushing hundreds of bones into fragments, boiling them for their grease, purely because the alternative was dying with a full stomach. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, and it comes from research that's still actively debated. At a site in Spain called Cima de los Huesos, containing bones from an early human relative dating back over 400,000 years, some researchers examining the internal structure of the bones found seasonal growth patterns that resemble something seen in hibernating animals, disruptions in bone development consistent with extended periods of severely reduced metabolic activity during the harshest parts of the year. The hypothesis, and it remains genuinely controversial among paleontologists, is that some early human relatives may have entered something resembling torpor, a slowed-down, hibernation-adjacent state, to survive winters too brutal to remain fully active through. Not confirmed, not universally accepted, but if true, it would mean some of your distant relatives didn't just endure the cold. They partially shut down to outlast it, the same trick a bear uses, deployed by something disturbingly close to human. There's a darker practical solution too, one that sounds almost too grim to be real, but shows up repeatedly across cold climate survival accounts. Using a freshly killed animal carcass as an emergency shelter, gutting a large animal and climbing inside the still warm body cavity for insulation against a sudden brutal drop in temperature is documented as a genuine last resort survival technique across multiple cold climate cultures, historically, and even in more recent survival accounts from extreme Arctic conditions. It sounds horrifying, and it is, but a corpse retains heat, and a corpse can be the difference between surviving a single catastrophic night and not. And then there's the quieter, less visceral darkness, the kind embedded not in a single dramatic act, but in constant grinding calculation. Skeletal remains from Ice Age populations frequently show what are called enamel hypoplasia lines, essentially scars left in tooth enamel by repeated episodes of severe malnutrition during childhood. These aren't rare anomalies. They show up across huge percentages of examined remains from harsh cold periods, meaning seasonal starvation wasn't an occasional crisis. For enormous stretches of prehistory, it was simply an expected recurring part of the yearly cycle, written permanently into the teeth of nearly everyone who survived childhood at all. So what does all of this actually add up to? Not a story about savagery, even though some of these details genuinely are savage by any modern standard. It's a story about the sheer weight of pressure cold climates placed on human survival, a pressure severe enough to justify butchering the dead, to justify crushing every bone for grease, to justify possibly slowing your own body's metabolism to nearly nothing, to justify climbing inside a disemboweled animal just to make it through until dawn. Every one of these behaviors sounds monstrous in isolation. In context, there's something closer to the opposite. Desperate, specific, carefully reasoned responses from people who were not choosing between comfort and hardship. They were choosing between doing something unthinkable and simply not existing anymore. So the next time you complain about a cold morning or shiver walking from your car to your front door, understand the scale of what your ancestors were actually up against. Not an inconvenience, an adversary patient enough to wait out entire populations, one that occasionally forced human beings into decisions history still struggles to look at directly. You inherited the ability to survive that. You just mercifully never had to find out exactly how far you'd go to use it.